Okay, so my name is Peter. Currently, I'm working for Transport for New South Wales. I've been there for about 4 months. You could say I'm a DevOps engineer. Some people don't like that title, but I actually quite like it. It's growing on me. Before I was at Transport for New South Wales, I was at Combank for about 2 years. So the current project I'm on, I came into it very late, so it didn't really make sense for me to say, hey, you should change what you're doing. And frankly, we didn't really have time to do that. So the project I'm on right now, no Docker at all. To be honest, I didn't mind. It was a good sort of chance to step back and think about, what does Docker really give us, and what does it, what is some of the shortcomings. So discarding any kind of presentation training that I may have done in the past, I've decided to opt for a top 10 format. And I didn't have time to order it, so in no particular order, I'd like to talk about some of the things I've missed and some of the things I haven't missed, and I may not actually make that distinction, just to make it harder for you guys. So there's this thing called separation of concerns, and I really hate quoting people because I feel like an idiot when I quote someone, but for some reason this keeps coming back to me. And I just want to read a little bit of it. So focusing one's attention upon some aspect, it does not mean ignoring the other aspects. It's just doing justice to the fact that from this aspect's point of view, the other is irrelevant. And so the thing that sticks with me with this quote is quite often when we've got a complex system and we've got people focusing on different things, we do have to kind of like narrow our perspective sometimes to kind of concentrate on a particular area of the system. And that's why I think good tooling is so important, because it enables us to do that, and it stops us from shooting ourselves in the foot if we're not concentrating on the right thing. That was just a bit of philosophy to get us started. So the next one is prod doesn't break your app with special. I must have written this quite late at night because it doesn't make any sense. But one thing I have noticed, stepping back from Docker is, boy, do host operating systems get complex. It's complex for a start, but then you add all your logging and your monitoring, and then someone gives you a jar or a WAR file that you're supposed to put on top of that, and maybe even several jar files. One thing that really annoys me is, so we've got an artifact, Java jar, whatever, and you're asked to change the Tomcat settings. It's like, Tomcat, that's not even part of your application. This doesn't make any sense. So that's one area where I think Docker is fantastic. The fact that you can just put everything that makes your app what it is in one place without any external server.properties or whatever, I think is great. And Java is actually like an easy example because it's more or less self-contained. If you've got a mixed environment where you've got some people want to write on Node or whatever, then this becomes even more salient of a point. How am I going for time? Oh, I need to speed up. This slide doesn't really have anything to do with anything, but when I was preparing the other day, I was on a bit of a mini sort of, what's the word, passive-aggressive rant kind of thing, and I thought one of the bad things about being an early adopter of Docker was, boy, did we have a lot of options. You could run Linux on your desktop, or you could run Vagrant, have a Linux VM, and then boot to Docker came along, and then Docker Machine, and Docker Machine was really good, and then Docker Inc. decided that they'd release Docker for Mac and Docker for Windows and kind of ignore Docker Machine, and all the while boot to Docker is still running, and in the end I'm just like, well, I just want to use Vagrant. It's better than any of the other things. I mean, I think Docker for Mac is like a really exciting piece of technology, but the thing that annoyed me about it was the first time I did a volume mount and I realized, no, this was Docker for Windows. I did a volume mount and I realized that inside my beautiful little Linux container, I had like Windows file permissions on my files. It's just like, oh, yuck, this is disgusting. So anyway, another thing is, this is just part of a mini rant, and this is my last mini rant slide. I basically think Docker became feature complete at about 1.6. I don't really see the point of having your containers talk to each other via network, like over tunnels between machines. I think that's kind of what VMs gave us, and I didn't really want Docker to become a replacement for VMs. I wanted it to be a way to containerize things on a single host. But anyway, that's kind of a... okay, next one. This one I think is quite cool, this idea of a one-way mirror. So if you've got a FreeBSD jail or a change root, the cool thing about it is your container, this is the opposite, just to confuse you guys, your container can't see out of it, but you on the host can see into it. So one example why this is cool is you can monitor what's happening inside your container, and you don't even need to enable any remote access to your container. You don't have to have an SSH daemon to log in and go, what's happening there? You can just look into it. But a counterpoint to that is I don't really see Docker as being a security solution. I think it's more secure than just running a whole bunch of separate apps on one host. Definitely more secure than that. But I don't really see it as being like an alternative to VMs. But then I don't really like VMs either. So, but my point is no, I do have a point, but I won't go into it. So anyway, you may have seen this picture before. It's the opposite of what I'm trying to explain. This is a public toilet, which you can't see into, but if you're on the inside of it, you can see out. So think of the opposite of this. Think of from inside your container, you cannot see your host, but from your host, you can see inside your container. All right. This is kind of a pointless graphic. Imagine you're on your host. You're not inside your containers. You're on the inside of the toilet. You can see inside your containers. You can list the processes. You can exec a command inside your containers. It's really quite awesome. But inside your containers, you can't actually see out. I mean, there might be some theoretical exploits where you can gain root and you can see your neighbors. But then the same is kind of true for virtual machines as well. Although there's probably less likelihood that you're going to escape from a virtual machine because you're virtualizing the guest OS as well. But anyway, who cares? All right, so this point I think is really important, and I wish I'd sort of paid more attention to this. Why not make all your containers just read-only? You know, if your app crashes because it was expected to write somewhere, and you didn't know it was going to write to this place, good, it should crash, that's great. Here's a picture of a cartridge. So the cool thing about Atari cartridges is if you found an Atari 2600 and you found a cartridge, it's probably going to work. How amazing is that? So I'm pretty confident in 10 years' time, if I dug out my Nginx 0.9.7 container, it's probably still going to work. You know? I just think that's awesome. And I get a bit of a nostalgia thing for Atari as well, even though it was a little bit before my time. Interesting fact, no, it's not an interesting fact. My grandmother lived on a farm and she had an Atari 2600. She also had a VHS player with a corded remote. Yeah. This is another sort of slide which doesn't really belong anywhere, but I'm going pretty well on time. We've still got 1 minute. Segue into Mesos versus Kubernetes. If you need to put your entire application into a single container and you have an init system in your container, I think that's okay, but it makes it harder to reuse containers. That's why the concept of a pod, which was sort of started with Kubernetes, but Racket also has that kind of concept built in. It's kind of cool because you co-locate your containers on a single host by design, and they're slightly more reusable because you can have your Nginx container rather than here's my Uber container which has Nginx and my app. But like I said, this is kind of out of order, so it doesn't really sort of fit the purpose. Smaller chunks, I actually forgot what I meant by this, but I found some interesting images. This is a Betty Crocker cake. I think if you have an app and it's in a container and it's running and it breaks, it's pretty easy to go, well, the part that broke was up here and my ops team put together this part here. You know, it's getting back to that separation of concerns thing. If you're dealing with a host which is running all these processes and you're an ops guy and something breaks, I mean, the best you can kind of say was, oh, I looked at vlog messages and you know, it's too big. But you got your layers, And I hate thinking of things in layers because I think it's hard to sort of comprehend. But if you take a step back and you go, well, these layers were from an image which was a base image that was given to me by my ops team, and then I added something on top of it, it becomes pretty clear who's responsible for what, which I think is quite good. I copied these colors into a diagram here, so it should be quite obvious what's going on here. This is my base image. This is my app image here. This is kind of a dorky way of saying that Docker kind of enforces a mechanism of making what you're trying to do a bit more explicit. You can say, this container listens on a certain port. How much memory do you need? 8 gigs. Okay, well, if you go over 8 gigs, it's going to crash. It's not going to break the VM. It's just going to crash. I'm not going to give you much CPU. It just makes things, the conversation a bit easier between what an app's expectations are and what you can actually put onto a machine. Endpoints are explicit, already covered that. Logging is uniform, kind of. I could go on another rant about Docker daemons deadlocking, taking up all your memory, thrashing CPU, restarting unexpectedly and restarting all your apps with it, but I won't. If you're not using Docker, then your Ansible code base has to do real work, which is quite disgusting, really. I'd gotten used to this idea that all I used Ansible for was coordinating machines, deploying containers, doing yum upgrades, restarting stuff, and back in non-Docker land, my Ansible roles like templating files and segregating apps into their own namespaces on the file system, things like that. That's what I was going to say. The recording actually got cut off. I'm not sure what happened there. Last point, last but not least. Actually, it could be least because these slides aren't ordered, as I said earlier. The ability to measure an app. So without Docker, you're kind of looking at certain aspects of the host and saying, well, I believe this characteristic applied to your app, but you're not really reasoning about the app itself. So with containers, you can say, well, I don't care how many processes you're running inside your app, but your container has these characteristics in terms of disk I/O, network utilization, things like that. So it just gives you a way to kind of reason about the characteristics of an app without having to get too bogged down into separating what is about the host or the logging infrastructure or whatever you got on your host versus the processes that make up your app. That's the point I was going to make. Thank you.